He saw her before the moment when the world narrowed to a single, terrible sound. Malik was carrying a box of oranges between his palms, the sun baking the awnings in the market, and the crowd moving like a slow river around him. Children ran underfoot, vendors shouted over the rattle of a nearby tram, and somewhere behind the spice stall, a radio crackled a song he knew the chorus to, but never the name of. He had been thinking of nothing: the rent, the stack of bills his mother left folded in a shoebox, the photograph of two strangers smiling in a kitchen that he kept under a loose floorboard. When he saw the girl, she was small, no more than 6, a crimson braid whipping across her jacket, eyes enormous and unmoored. She was looking at the painted pigeons on a stall's awning like it was the most important thing she'd ever seen. She was also on the far side of the stall, between the stall and the road, where the tram rails ended and the traffic picked up speed. The world pivoted then. Malik's hands rose before his brain had time to issue an order. A delivery truck, backing out from a narrowed lane, put its engine into a hungry growl and misjudged the space. A crate clattered off the truck's tailgate. The crate tilted. The driver cursed. There were a dozen people who heard it, a dozen who glanced briefly and kept walking. But Malik heard the soft scrape different, the sound of a child's shoe against stone. He surged, more animal than man, and stumbled through the crowd, the oranges weighting his forearms. He reached the girl as she had misstepped between the pavement and the road. His shoulder caught her small shoulder, and for a blink their bodies collided. For a second, there were 3 hands on the child, Malik's and another pair, gloved and decisive, that hauled her fully away from the truck's path. The man who grabbed her had the air of someone who had practiced emergency life dozens of times and had learned how to be quick about it. Precise, unshowy. But there was a force to him that other forces deferred to. He was tall and older, wearing a light coat even though the day had warmed, and his collar was fractionally too fine for the market. People stepped back, as if the air around him belonged to a different temperature. Someone in the crowd called his name, half in awe, half in the idle way cities do when they name a person they only know through magazine portraits. The newspapers would later print photographs of that moment. The billionaire with one hand on the girl's shoulder, the boy with the oranges a step behind, a market awning in disarray and a crate frozen mid-fall. The headlines would say, "What sells?" "Billionaire saves adopted daughter," and attach the image to a life they knew only by biography blurbs and press conferences. For Malik, the image was simpler and more complicated. He had been there. He had touched the girl's sleeve. He had felt for a second the possibility that what happened to ordinary people's lives could be stopped. When the danger had passed, when the truck had rumbled away and the crowd resumed the business of the day, the man, Julian Carrington, Malik would learn, as if the name were a fact dropped from the sky, turned to the boy with the oranges. His eyes were not the oblique, unreachable pair Malik had expected from photographs. They were clean and astonished. "You okay?" he asked. Malik nodded, because he was the kind of young man who nodded when spoken to in a voice like that. The girl tucked herself under the man's arm like she belonged there, as if the arm was a shelter she had always known. Malik felt the sting of something older, the remembered shape of hands he had once called father and mother, the abrupt absence of those hands the year the warehouse collapsed. His jaw tightened. He had learned to keep his face blank when grief made itself known. In public, grief could be a ticket to pity or suspicion, and neither helped buy bread. Julian Carrington pressed his lips together, an expression that indicated gratitude and the self-aware awkwardness of a man who rarely found himself in a market. "Where are you from?" he asked the girl. "Come on, Lila, say your name." "Lila," she said, and the name landed in Malik's chest like a small stone. Lila looked at him as if she had just seen someone she could trust. Children have a fast, exacting way of dividing the world into safe and not safe that the rest of us forget to use. Later, the crowd would remember Julian's badge of wealth, the folded cuff, the patient hand that did not pry the child's loose braid away, and they would tell one another how the billionaire had been at the market that morning in a rare public appearance. But for the people who had been watching closer, who lived 3 stalls away and had an ear for small details, the morning meant something else, a connection threaded between strangers. Malik had touched the child, the billionaire had protected her. Both acts would later turn into invitations. Julian insisted on thanking Malik properly. He unfolded crisp bills, and then, as if he could read the difficulty in Malik's hands, he folded them back and pulled his phone from his pocket. "You will let me take you for lunch," he said. Not an offer and not a command. He put it out like a possibility and waited for the boy to see whether it would be taken. Malik felt the crowd shrink to the size of that decision. He chose the lunch, because when offers that might change things fall into your lap, you take them, especially if the alternative is to keep walking and forget. He would later tell himself he'd gone because he wanted a meal in a place that had no smell of oil in its corners. The truth was that he wanted to know why a man like Julian Carrington would be in a market where the trash bins were full and the pigeons lived like kings. They walked to a cafe with a small terrace, the kind with brass lamps and napkins folded in little white mountains. Julian spoke in the way of people who are used to being handled by committees. His voice softened with an attempt at being ordinary. Lila sat between them, her knees bumping Malik's as if their proximity affirmed some new treaty. The billionaire's coat came off and was placed with careful hands over Lila's shoulders, as if the coat itself were a spoken promise. "What's your name?" Julian asked again, as much to Malik as to indicate he was keeping the moment light. "Malik," he said. It sounded like a promise sealed in a coin purse, small, admitting nothing but present. Julian regarded him, and Malik could feel, without flattery, that he had been seen. "Malik," Julian repeated. "Tell me about yourself." Malik named the things he could name without giving his life away. Where he worked, the market where he could be found, how he delivers oranges and men's cracked crates. He did not say the word orphan first. He let the cardigan and the photograph under the floorboard keep some of the grief in a private place. He told small stories instead, about a stall that sold the best sweet figs, a delivery that taught him how to catch a crate before it fell. And Julian listened like a man collecting stories for some later reckoning. After the meal, Julian insisted on paying, not with the smallness of a one-time gesture, but with an offer of something larger. "If you ever need work," he said, "I have a foundation that funds community programs. Or I can get you a proper job doing deliveries at our company. It's steady, and there are benefits." He said benefits with a gravity that made Malik think of doctor's visits and paid leave. He had never thought about benefits as a possible reality. He had been surviving by being nimble and invisible. The word made him dizzy. Malik refused, as is polite in such circumstances. He insisted he had work he cared about and that he liked the market too much to give it up. Julian smiled in a way that suggested he both understood and had already anticipated the refusal. "All right," he said. "If you change your mind, call the number." He slid a small card across the table, the kind of card that lives now and in 1,000 other hands, glossy with a logo. Malik took it, but, curiously, tucked it into the same pocket where he kept the photograph of strangers. They took a picture in the cafe because someone in the terrace wanted to post it, not maliciously, more like a souvenir of a morning when 2 different worlds brushed. Malik stood by the table, feeling as though he were on the edge of someone else's life. Lila waved at the camera like an angel of a neighborhood that had become, for one frame, something else. The early days that followed were strange in the way of small, precise storms. Julian called once, then twice, and each time it was with the polite, rehearsed pause of a man unaccustomed to reaching out beyond his controlled orbit. He insisted on sending Lila a book he thought she might like, and Malik went to the address he had been given to drop off a copy of the very fig jam they had spoken about at the market. The house Julian kept for Lila, a modest wing attached to an immaculate townhouse, smelled of lemon and old paper. It had framed prints on the wall and a stair that creaked the same way any honest stair creaked. They were not ostentatious. Julian kept his distance in all the ways a man who purchased privacy keeps distance. He offered care and protection, but showed his affections like signage rather than full exposure. There was a trust in how he watched Lila. He watched her with the care of someone who was learning the grammar of another life, careful not to make mistakes out of inexperience. He watched with the kind of fear a parent sometimes feels for the first time. The protective honesty of someone who would rather yield everything than watch a small world be harmed. And yet the gratitude that had been offered in the cafe was not uncomplicated. Malik felt it press on him like two hands, one of thankfulness, one of suspicion. He had been thanked publicly and folded into an orbit that could carry him beyond the market. He had been offered a way out. But gratitude now entangled with a memory he could not unsee. The photograph under the floorboard, the day the warehouse collapsed, the list of names his mother had kept in a soft black notebook, where she wrote dates and small complaints and the names of the contractors who came through their neighborhood. There was something in that notebook, something that had been carefully muted after the accident, something someone had given orders to ignore. Malik lived in a cramped flat above an appliance shop, and every night that he returned the photograph under the floorboard, as if he were returning a coin. He had built an entire small religion out of silence. It had been necessary because the only other option was to stand and scream at the injustice of it all. Silence cost him less in the short term. But when he handed Lila back to Julian that afternoon on the pavement by the townhouse, he noticed for the first time a logo on the girl's small backpack. A faded oval, blue and white, the word Arden, barely visible where the seam had rubbed the ink away. Arden. The name lodged in him like a burr. 2 weeks later, he sat on his thrift store couch with his fist around a mug of black tea, and he opened the shoebox he kept beneath the floorboard. He had been avoiding it, as if avoidance could make the name less dangerous. When he lifted the lid, the same photograph of his parents smiled up at him. His mother's handwriting on the back read, May 8th, complaint logged. He had kept that shoebox like a talisman. He had kept it because memory, unlike a wound, is not healed by hiding. He pulled out the soft black notebook of his mother. It smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. He thumbed through the pages until his finger stopped at a list of names and dates, and written after one line in a hurried scrawl, the word Arden circled. There was also a paperclip with a small scrap of tape attached, a sliver from a sight. The same blue and white script he had seen on Lila's backpack. He did not know at first whether it was coincidence or evidence. He had never been the kind of person to connect a child's backpack to the contractors who came through the district. But names are like the small things children lose. Once you notice them, they keep appearing on the street. He had not the language to accuse, only the muscle memory of suspicion. He folded the paper back into the notebook and set his mug down too hard. Tea slopped onto the couch, a dark stain he would remove with table salt tomorrow. A week later, in his pocket, the glossy card from Julian's wallet wrinkled like a used ticket. He smoothed it flat and drove his thumb across the logo. Arden. For reasons he could not explain without feeling like a man who had let grief make a claim on his judgment, he began to follow the thread. The first time he told someone out loud, it was to his oldest friend, Rico, an electrician who worked nights and talked too fast when he drank too much coffee. They sat in a doorway by the train yard while the evening cooled, and a boy 2 doors down played a tinny trumpet. "I think that logo is the same," Malik said. He had the notebook, a small photograph of a broken wall with a blue sticker affixed to it, and the card Julian had given him. He laid them out between his knees like offerings. Rico whistled low. Arden. He had heard the name before, passed in the same way rumors pass, quickly, without detail. They do a lot of contracts, government stuff, bridges, clinics, you know. His brows drew together in an expression Malik had seen when someone was trying on an idea for size. You think they had something to do with your... Malik felt the sentence break off like a clipped wire. He had not yet decided what to think. The memory of his parents, the way they'd sung while making dinner, the slam of a radio at night, was too close to the edges to be examined properly. Maybe, he said, maybe it's nothing. But when the market's barista, a woman named Maeve, who listened more than she spoke, mentioned she had seen a man in a hard hat with an Arden badge near his parents' building years before, the nothing became a worry you couldn't shake. Maeve's voice was small but steady. I remember, she said. There was a lot of fixing after that storm. They put up scaffolding and took pictures, and then everything stopped being the same. Here is the way small towns work in cities. A logo seen on a child's backpack becomes a map if enough people have the same memory. Words collect into patterns. The name Arden began to appear like a water stain under paint. On a torn cardboard square in the alley, a hazy stamp on the back of a youth program leaflet, a sticker at the edge of a photograph Malik found tucked into the newspaper clipping his mother had kept. Not proofs, not yet. Just a trail of small, plausible links. Julian Carrington, when Malik mentioned the name, widened his eyes in a way that had nothing performative about it. Arden, he said. We used Arden systems for a couple of smaller projects years back, mostly maintenance contracts at community centers. I didn't think... He paused and raised his hands, as if to rearrange the dates in his head. Why? Is this connected to something? Malik did not want to raise his voice. He had learned to preserve the line between accusation and conversation. It might not be, he said, but my mother kept notes. She mentioned Arden. She circled it once. Sometimes names come up in places you'd least expect. Julian's face shifted. He went into that particular expression adults got when a childhood fact turned into an adult problem. The furrow of someone mapping past decisions against current truths. If you want, we can look into it, he offered. It was not a legal promise. It was an invitation dressed in the currency Julian knew how to spend, access. Malik felt the invitation like a lever under his chest. He could hand what he had to Julian and let someone with resources sort it, or he could keep digging with his own hands, which were less skilled for uncovering old bureaucracy, but more faithful to the small facts memory held. Both options seemed to require a form of courage. Malik smelled both like smoke and iron. To go with Julian meant risking being a patient in someone else's moral project. To go alone meant standing at the edge of a gutter and trying to read the moon's reflection. It was around then that Lila began to trust him in the quiet ways children do, by giving him a crayon drawing that had a crooked sun and two stick figures labeled Lila and Malik, by pressing a paper heart into his palm and promising to remember him. He kept those tokens like contraband. They were small sanctities he did not allow others to know about. He told himself he was protecting them as much as the girl, though part of him wanted to keep the warmth for himself, because warmth had become rare. One afternoon, as he sat on the stoop outside his building, Malik noticed the edge of a pastel-covered notebook peeking from Lila's backpack as she ran to meet a friend. It had a ribbon tied loosely around the spine. He had no right to look through a child's things, but the world had owned pieces of his life without asking, and curiosity, that loyalty to the small truths, made a demand. He waited until Lila went to chase a friend toward the park, and then he picked up the notebook as gently as if it were sleeping. It was Child's handwriting inside, lists of errands, a drawing of a cat, a pressed daisy, and on the back, folded into an inner page like a folded hand, was a scrap of paper, a small admission of grown-up things hidden in a child's diary. A ferry ticket, a half-printed receipt with a line that read, AR 01 15-12, Arden Maintenance. The date matched almost too precisely, a date his mother had noted in her own soft notebook. Someone could have sewn 100 plausible explanations into such a piece of paper. An accidental misplacement, a ticket from some unrelated chore, or it could be the beginning of a chain. Malik closed the notebook and wrapped the ribbon around it again, because the act of folding two truths into one object made him less complicit in whatever would follow. He could keep it to himself. He could hand it to Julian. He could show Maeve or Rico. Each option carried a different weight. Secrets, he had learned, are heavy as engines and can burn your hands if you hold them too long. He decided to tell Julian the truth in a cafe, because cafes were where small confessions were made and accepted into cups of coffee. Julian listened without interruption as Malik unfolded the map. The logo he had seen, the page he now had in his pocket, the dates that sat like small, unwieldy anchors in his mother's handwriting. Lila sat with a colouring book between them, unaware of the adult geography being traced at her little table. Julian's face changed during the telling. At first his brow knit, and he asked for clarifying facts. Then there was a stillness that had the flavour of a man who had just tasted something sour in a glass he'd believed sweet. Arden was subcontracted on several jobs a decade ago, he said finally. The word subcontracted landed like a technicality, but Malik felt it as if it were a made-up defense. We hired them in good faith. If there's evidence of negligence, of course we'll look into it. He did not say, I didn't know, which was both interesting and telling. He said instead, we'll look into it. Look into it how? Malik asked. He didn't trust polite offers with openings like that. He had lived in a city of looking into things that often resolved into polite, ephemeral reports with no consequence. Julian leaned forward. There was an urgency in how he folded his hands, something private and immediate. I'll start at our end, he said. I'll ask our archives department to pull the files from that period. I'll have people check subcontractor rosters. But Malik... He stopped, and for the first time in the months Malik had known him, Julian's mouth made the shape of an apology, without the words. I can't promise what you'll want the answer to be. I can't promise it will change what happened. But we'll find out. Malik left the cafe with more than he had come with. He had a promise, and he also had the strip of paper in his pocket that smelled faintly of ferry salt and a child's crayon. He had also, strangely, an obligation to himself to see if the words in his mother's notebook would line up with documents that had eyes and ink and signatures. He had taught himself how to be small in a world that overlooked things. Now he was aware that being small was not the same as being passive. In the days that followed, small truths began to thread through Malik's life like stray cords. A woman at the youth center, Maeve, remembered a list of men who had come to repair a roof. A man named Toby, who said he'd seen men from Arden in vans near a district building the day the warehouse alarms had malfunctioned. A photograph his mother had kept showed a scaffolding in front of the warehouse with a faded circular sticker at the base, half peeled away, the letters R remaining like a mouthful of a name. Julian called with updates that were careful and measured, and contained within the sort of language that corporate departments use to avoid setting a claim. There are gaps in the records, he told Malik on one of those calls. Some invoices were filed under a different account name, and a couple of the project managers are no longer with the company. It may take time. Be patient with me. Patience, Malik had learned, is a currency for those who can afford to wait. He had none to spare, not when his parents' name sat in a notebook like a pressed bruise. Yet he let Julian search. He wanted to know whether the billionaire who shielded his daughter from a crate was willing to look into who had sealed his past in silence. It was Maeve who gave him the next thread. She had seen Lila with a girl named Zoe, who lived 3 buildings down and collected lost toys like a personal ministry. Zoe and a cluster of neighborhood kids belonged to a loose band of friends who'd kept a kind of map of the district's comings and goings. "They talk," Maeve said simply. "Kids talk to each other. If Lila was around someone who had a notebook, they'd share things. They say what adults don't say sometimes, like the name of a van or the smell of paint." Malik went to Zoe first, as if approaching a shrine. Zoe wore a headband with a crooked heart and chewed a pencil. The seriousness of a child who knows too much and too little at once. She was willing to trade gossip for a crisp biscuit Malik had found in his pocket. Lila had a notebook and sometimes she'd write things, Zoe said. She wrote ferry once and a date. She once said something about a man who didn't smile and a truck with Arden on the door. Zoe's eyes drifted toward the park where other kids were playing. "We thought it was a band name," she added, as if that explained everything. The notebook's fragments and the kids' whispered confessions began to coalesce into an outline of events. It was not enough to prove anything. It was enough to be a question with teeth, a question that could not be swallowed easy. Malik's hand rested that night on the shoebox under the floorboard. He could give the scraps to Julian and watch the billionaire open doors. He could also keep going the way he had been going all his life, step by small step, talking to the people with greasy palms and quick memories, following rumors of vans and sticky labels until a story unfolded from the seams. There was one more thing he had not considered until a rusted ledger arrived in the post. A mistake of bureaucracy that looked like a bill. It fell into Malik's hands as if the city itself had a sense of irony. The ledger was addressed to a community center on the far side of the district, and inside, amidst the innocuous prattle of funding lines, was a penciled note. Arden, payroll adjustment 03-18-12. The date matched a line in his mother's notebook. Whoever had mailed it had not intended Malik. It had been misfiled at the center and then given to him by a well-meaning coordinator who thought the boy with the oranges had a right to know. Malik did not open the ledger in public. He took it to the back room of the cafe and sat with it like a man holding the outline of a possible wound. Here in the quiet, the small dots connected into lines. Not answers, but a map that made it harder for the official rhetoric of accident to sit restful. There was, in the ledger, a notation. Site delay. Safety protocol reassessments deferred. The words had the soft cruelty of corporate euphemism. For Malik, whose mother had circled Arden in thick black ink like a curse, the ledger was a new object that made the past less distant. He called Julian that night, and he talked until the line went dead, and the call dropped. Julian's voice was steady, but tired. He promised more than he could measure. Internal inquiries, archive pulls, a willingness to pursue the matter even if it led to awkward rooms and uncomfortable answers. Malik listened, and then, when he hung up, he felt something dangerous rise in his chest, the kind of hope that can be useful and also ruinous. He had never asked for much from the world. He had only wanted his mother's handwriting to mean something. Now it had the potential to mean accountability. It also had the potential to be folded away by lawyers and PR statements. The market continued to buzz on the other side of the city, uninterested in the way 2 lives were beginning to thread together. People bought bunches of cilantro, argued over the price of fish, and children chased pigeons while their mothers negotiated the price of tomatoes. Lila colored in a book and gave Malik a portrait she'd drawn of the 3 of them standing together under a big sun. Malik pinned it on the wall above his kitchen table, the image like a vow. When the notebook reappeared, the one he had held when Lila left it behind, he opened it again at home, slowly. like someone opening a letter they feared for its consequences. Between doodled hearts and a crude drawing of a ferry, Lila had pressed a small scrap, a receipt for a ferry ride dated March 18, 2012, the same as the ledger's note. The date had once been another's pain. Now it threaded like a rope through Malik's life and Julian's small unease. He imagined telling Julian everything at once and watching the billionaire's face collapse into recognition. He imagined telling no one and carrying the burden alone until it burned his hands raw. The moral dilemma sat in his gut like a stone. To protect Lila's new life with Julian by keeping quiet, or to follow the paper trail he could now see and risk destroying the fragile sanctuary the girl had found. When he fell asleep, his dreams stitched together fragments. A crate falling, the name Arden written in his mother's rounded script, a child skipping stones, a man in a suit with his back to a window, and his own small hands holding a notebook like a single lamp. He woke with a resolve that surprised him. Secrets, he decided, could be shared in measured doses. He could go to Julian with fragments and ask for help in a way that did not feel like a threat. He could also prepare himself to ask more awkward questions if answers were polished behind white paper. He had to be careful. He had learned the hard way that sometimes the truth hurts the people you love most. So he did what he always did when he had to step into the dark. He made a plan. First, he would corroborate the scraps he already had: Zoe's memory, Maeve's sightings, the ledger misdelivered by the community center. Second, he would keep the notebook safe and return it to Lila at a later time without saying why he'd seen it. Third, he would let Julian conduct the search he had offered, but under one condition. He would be kept informed, not as an outsider, but as someone entitled to the facts if they touched his past. Julian, to his credit, agreed with the kind of sincerity that was not theatrical. "We'll proceed carefully," he said during a phone call that lasted long into the night. "If Arden bears any responsibility, then we owe the truth to anyone affected. There are things I have to look through, but Malik, I want you to know I'm not doing this to soothe my conscience. I'm doing it because I have a responsibility." "Responsibility," Malik said, tasting the word as if it might be bitter. He knew the word could be wide enough to fit a globe and narrow enough to be tokenized. He asked quietly, "Will you tell Lila about any of this?" Julian hesitated. He did not answer at once, which was telling. "Not unless it's necessary," he said. "She is safe. She should not be dragged into adult questions she doesn't understand. We'll protect her. Protect her." Malik thought of his mother, who had protected him the only way children sometimes get protected, by masking fear in jokes and by saving loose change in a tin. Protecting someone also meant telling them the truth when the truth had weight and consequence. He wanted to press Julian on that, to make him say if the billionaire would risk reputation for truth. But the cafe's streetlights clicked on, and the hum of traffic rose, and a silence settled between them, like a thin film. The next morning, Malik took the shoebox and the black notebook to a woman named Rosa, who ran a tiny archive in the neighborhood, a person who collected ephemera and memories with the sort of tenderness institutions sometimes lack. Rosa spread the papers on her table like someone laying out precious bones. The room smelled of dust and glue and the heavy sweetness of paper left in sunlight. Old posters were pinned to one wall. A battered radio hummed quietly in the corner. Malik watched as she turned the pages of his mother's notebook with the kind of reverence people reserve for objects that contain other people's lives. "She kept careful notes," Rosa said softly. Her finger paused at a list, at the scrawl that had once been a hand calling for answer. "People who catalogue grief make it practical. Names, dates, small complaints, so the chaos can be located." Malik felt the old feeling, wanting to both dissolve and hold on. He had brought the notebook and the misdelivered ledger and the scrap of ferry ticket folded into its pages. He had brought them all the way across the neighborhood because Rosa had the patience for paper that remembered things the way people forgot them. Rosa pulled a thin envelope from a drawer and, with a small ritual, set out a magnifying glass. Under a pool of lamplight, the letters on a faded sticker sharpened. The blue oval of Arden reluctantly revealed itself. Rosa's lips parted. "This is maintenance," she said. "A sticker from a subcontractor. They collect them like stamps." She rifled through the ledger Malik had carried in from the cafe, penciled notes, a string of numbers, an entry flagged in a hurried hand. "Site delay. Safety protocol reassessments deferred." She read it twice, aloud, the words falling into the room like small, undeniable truths. "It says deferred," Malik said. The word was a stone in his palm. Rosa looked up. "Deferred doesn't mean it never mattered. Deferred means someone chose to postpone safety in favor of something else. Costs, schedules, convenience. People make those choices where they're allowed to, and then someone else pays." The archive's lamp made the letters glow. Malik traced the penciled note with his finger, as if fingering a fresh bruise. He wanted to ask Rosa to make it scream into evidence, tell him who to name, where to go. But he had learned to be cautious. This was not his battle alone anymore. It had unfolded into a map with edges someone powerful might not like to see traced. Rosa folded the ledger into a careful packet and taped it. "Take this to Julian," she said quietly. "Get his help with the records. He has access. But take a photocopy. Leave an original here. I can make notes that we both can rely on." Malik hesitated because of the shape of gratitude that had grown between him and the billionaire. He recalled the morning at the market, and how easily the city's cameras had turned a private moment into a headline. He remembered Julian's offer. Access dressed as kindness. To hand the ledger back intact to Julian felt like handing over the only thing that might prove his mother's careful handwriting mattered. Yet Rosa's eyes were steady. "You have a right to ask questions," she said, "but you don't have to be the only one looking." He left the archive with copies carefully folded, feeling as if he'd moved a load from his chest to someone else's cart. Over the next days, the neighborhood buzzed with a quiet urgency. Zoe and her friends began to speak in small bursts, trading scraps like sailors trading maps. Toby, who had once worked odd jobs for the neighborhood, came forward after Maeve nudged him with a look that said, "This is bigger than gossip." "They had a van," Toby said, tapping his cigarette down to a nub as he told his memory. His voice was rough from years of inhaling cold air on construction nights. "A white van. Arden on the side, you know. I saw it near the warehouse the week before the incident. Guys with hard hats went in like they were ticking boxes. I thought it was routine." "Did you hear anything about alarms?" Malik asked. His voice did not rattle. It had learned precision where emotions might otherwise overspill. "There was chatter," Toby said. "They said something about a sensor being finicky. Someone joked that they could patch it for cheap. I didn't think—" He shook his head. "I wasn't there the day it happened, but I saw them after. They were packing up fast, like they'd been told to leave." Each little testimony stitched itself to the ledger's note. The ferry ticket in Lila's notebook had a date that matched a penciled line in Malik's mother's list. Zoe remembered Lila talking about riding the ferry once because the water smelled like sea and freedom. Maeve remembered a man with an Arden badge near Malik's parents' apartment months before collapse. The city is a place where memory hides in the smallest spaces. When enough people bring those spaces into light, the pattern emerges. Julian took the copies with a seriousness that made Malik want to both trust and watch him. He assigned a young archivist from his foundation to work with Rosa. The archivist came with neat gloves and a soft voice, and he treated the papers like sacred objects. He also had access to Julian's company's vault, digital records, procurement logs, invoices that did not fit in shoeboxes and needed servers and passwords. A week of quiet, cautious cooperation passed. Julian called Malik with updates that were careful in a way that exasperated Malik. Measured phrases like, "there are discrepancies," and "we're cross-referencing contracts," but contained, too, the kind of urgency that had cut into Julian's larger life. "I want this done properly," Julian told Malik over the phone one night. "If there was negligence, we owe it the truth." Malik watched Julian the way you watch weather. A man who had made storms and then learned to watch them from a distance. He was not, Malik had learned, a man who wanted to be small. He wanted to fix things in the way people with power think of fixing things. But power does not erase complication. The more the archivist opened files, the more tangled the story became. There were invoices filed under an intermediary company, an account created by a procurement manager with a fondness for shorthand. There were hand-scrawled notes, approve cost saving, and a barely legible initial he recognized as a single letter, looped and hurried, C. The archivist ran a search across old emails and found one thread that pinched Malik's throat, a message chain where maintenance budgets were trimmed and Arden was asked to speed up a contract at lower cost. The contract bore the signature of Arden's local manager and an approval code from Julian's company, an approval that, in the company's ledger, traced back to a procurement desk. Julian read the email with a face that lost color in a way that made Malik's stomach drop. It was not an accusation written in the text. It was a bureaucratic artifact. Proceed with subcontracting under community maintenance. Cost savings prioritized. Julian had not personally signed the line, but the approval code carried the authority of the company he had built. The shock for him was less about intent and more about culpability. The choices his organization had normalized had allowed the conditions for negligence. He came to Malik that evening without the reflex of PR or posture. They met in a cafe whose terrace had been the place where their relationship began. Lila sat drawing at a small table nearby. Julian placed the printed emails between them like a handful of stones. The air smelled of roasted beans and evening cold. "I didn't know this," Julian said. "We outsourced. It should have been standard oversight. The notation here suggests a decision to reprioritize. Someone approved lower bids in the name of efficiency, not monitoring, not follow-up. The language, they used deferred reassessment." Malik's hands tightened around his cup. "My mother's note said Arden, and she circled it like it was a danger. We have a ferry ticket, a ledger with that penciled note, witnesses who saw the vans and men with Arden badges. It's not a conspiracy. It's a trail." Julian read the ledger's penciled note and the ferry receipt and the slips of paper. A silence, big and full, settled. He had built things that mattered to him with an aim to make community work sustainable, but here, in his company's own archives, he saw a familiar pattern, a decision that balanced cost and human safety, and chose the former. "What do you want me to do?" he asked finally. It was not a lawyer's question. It was a man's plea for direction from someone whom he trusted enough to ask without performance. Malik thought of his mother's handwriting, the way she'd circled Arden in thick black ink, as if to brand the name into permanence. He thought of the ledger, the ferry ticket, the kids' whispers. He thought of Lila drawing suns, and of the way Julian had wrapped his coat around her shoulders that first day. He had a moral cross in his hands: reveal the whole and risk undoing Lila's safe life, or let it slip, maybe forever. He could not abide either easily. "Make it public," Malik said. The words shocked him by their simplicity. "Not out for headlines, open an independent inquiry. Fund it, yes, but let it be independent. Bring in people who don't work for you. Promise transparency, and tell the families you find about the findings personally. Don't let PR or lawyers seal it shut." Julian swallowed. He had spent his life avoiding the glare of spectacle enough to know how quickly a story like this could be weaponized. But he also had the resources to begin what Malik asked. "I'll hire an independent investigator," he said. "I'll open the files. I'll make sure anyone affected has a path to come forward." "And Lila?" Malik asked before the words left his mouth. "Don't make this about her. Keep her out of the rooms where they ask the hard questions." "No," Julian said with a sudden absolute clarity. "Not unless she asks." He paused. "I'll tell her that someone is looking into the past, but nothing about the particulars. She deserves normal." They agreed on a way forward. An investigative team without ties to Julian's company would be funded by Julian's foundation, but chosen by a panel that included Rosa and an independent counsel Malik trusted. That arrangement, an uneasy triangle of money, independence and community oversight, felt to Malik like a compromise he could live with. It acknowledged that money carries influence, and that influence must be managed by accountability. The investigation began with small, patient steps. The independent investigator, Asha, a woman whose glasses always slid to the tip of her nose and whose questions were surgical, came to the neighborhood and listened. She interviewed Zoe and her friends, Toby, Maeve, and the barista, who remembered the day men in hard hats came. She requested files, procurement records, photographs, site plans. She catalogued each item with the same care Rosa showed the notebook. One afternoon, Asha asked to see Malik's mother's notebook. She held it with a steady, precise tenderness and read through the names as if aligning them against a grid. "People like to keep lists," she said half to Malik. "When they keep them, it is because they suspect something and want to make it findable later." Asha's staff marched through Julian's company's archive and within the sealed records of old projects found a line that felt like the final stitch. There was a procurement memo from the year in question that recommended reassigning minor maintenance contracts to a lower-cost subcontractor to meet budgetary reallocations for community outreach. The memo's sign-off was a block initial from a procurement manager, CP, who'd later been promoted and then retired. In the margins, scrawled in a different hand, was a date and the suggestion, "Defer protocol reassessment, expedite completion." The tone was neutral, the consequence malignant. But documents are not merely ink. They need people to give them teeth. The investigation located a decommissioned project scope stamped with Arden's logo and found a hand-signed delivery note from an Arden supervisor who had, months later, sent a terse email. "Safety sensors reported intermittent. We will patch temporarily until materials are ready." The email had no follow-up. The ledger's penciled note, "Safety protocol reassessments deferred," had become an artifact in men's correspondence, a decision to postpone. Asha also found a voice. A man named Marco, who had once worked as a site foreman and who had been loath to speak because he feared unemployment, stepped forward under the weight of evidence and the protection the independent inquiry promised. He told them, in a voice made small by fear and then steadied by necessity, that Arden crews had been instructed to rush the repair, to keep the site operational, even when alarms acted up. "We were told to fix it like it wasn't a priority," Marco said. "If something failed later, we were told to file it under maintenance error. I left soon after. I couldn't keep doing it." It wasn't a dramatic confession. It was a practical account of corner-cutting with real consequences. Again, the story of choices that put speed over safety. The pattern that emerged was clear enough to shock without needing to vilify a single soul beyond their moment of decision. Julian had not personally ordered the cuts, but his company, seeking to redistribute funds toward community projects, had authorized decisions that deprioritized certain safety checks. In the tangle of corporate accounting, small compromises had been made with human lives as an externality. The shock landed on Julian like a physical thing. He visited archives, sat with numbers, traced signatures, and realized that systems had been set up that made negligence easier. He had always thought his philanthropy was a repaired ledger, giving back in places that hurt. But here he faced the reality that his own firm had, in trying to balance scales, tipped some plates the wrong way. The cafe where they had first sat became the scene of a quieter confrontation some weeks later. Malik had insisted they meet there in public. He wanted a neutral place where neither could call on staff to act as buffer. Rosa came with her own worn notebook. Asha brought photocopies of procurement memos with dates circled in red. Lila sat with friends at a small table some yards away, drawing, her world still of crayons and suns. Malik slid a photocopy across to Julian with a hand that did not tremble. The page was the most damning strip of paper Asha had found, a procurement memo threaded with approval codes and a summary that read, in plain bureaucratic language, reassign maintenance under low-cost subcontractor, implement expedited schedule, defer non-critical safety reassessment. Julian's breath left him like air from a lung. He read the memo twice. I approved budgets that allowed for reassignments, he said finally, but I didn't read every memo at the time. We had people assigned to ensure standards. Whoever signed this made a choice, and the choice was cost over reassessment. That choice cost lives, Malik said quietly, but with the weight of accusation in it. Julian's eyes filled. I didn't know, he repeated. The words were incomplete, inadequate. He knew inwardly they were true as far as they went. He also knew they would not be enough. Will you take responsibility? Malik asked. The question was not a legal demand. It was a plea for moral clarity. One man asking another if his life would rise to meet the truth. Julian looked at the photocopy, at the red-circled date, then at Malik. He stood and left money on the table, an old habit of setting things where they would not be argued over, and walked with a steady pace away from the terrace. He did not talk when he left. No PR statement, no coached lines. He went to his office and called a meeting with the board, with counsel, and with the independent investigator. What followed was not a tidy public spectacle, but a sequence of decisions that risked his reputation. He made a statement. He would open company records. He would commission an external audit. He would fund a reparative program for families affected by past decisions. He did not promise legal outcomes. He could not make the courts move on someone else's clock. He promised transparency, support for an independent investigation, and publicly accessible archives of the procurement decisions of the past decade. The investigators found more. An old procurement director's memo explaining that budgets for community outreach had been increased, and to make room, smaller maintenance tasks were reprioritized. The director had written in an almost bureaucratic murmur, recommend cost reallocation, community initiatives to receive fund augmentation. The director had since retired. Some of the individuals involved had moved on. None of it absolved the truth that decisions made in boardrooms had real-world ripple effects. Julian did something many men in positions like his did not. He accepted that corporate responsibility did not dissolve simply because no one had intended harm. He asked the company to accept an independent review, and he met, privately and without cameras, with several people who had been harmed by the past decisions. He offered reparative support, funds to cover medical bills, assistance for families navigating legal options, and the establishment of a neighborhood safety fund to audit and maintain local infrastructure. He also asked for forgiveness in the most human way, by listening. One afternoon, Malik accompanied Julian to meet two of the families who had lost someone in the collapse. The meetings were wrapped in quiet, no cameras, no press. Julian sat like a man who had been stripped of the protective armor of perception and had to face the human consequence of a ledger. He did not make grand statements. He sat, hands folded, and let the families speak. He offered what he could, financial help, support for memorials, and a willingness to make any internal files he had accessible to investigators. He pledged to work with local leaders to establish better oversight mechanisms in future municipal contracts and to fund an independent watchdog for contractor safety in neighborhoods like Malik's. For Malik, seeing Julian sit in those rooms with his chin unguarded was a kind of ending and a new beginning. It did not give him back his parents. It did not erase the years of scraping for rent and the cold nights stacked on top of silence. But it was something, a measure of acknowledgement from the world that had the power to make those choices. The press smelled a story and built one, less sensational than they'd have liked, but enough to turn a page. Headlines were careful. Billionaire funds independent probe after past contracts questioned. The nuance was thinner on paper than in the rooms where people had been listening and talking and deciding. Julian released a statement, not a confession of criminal intent, but a pledge to pursue transparency. Asher's investigation published a report that laid out the chain of procurement decisions and recommended criminal review where negligence could be alleged. The report did not pronounce arrest, it recommended further legal inquiry. That, in itself, was the rightness of the process. Truth leading toward consequences, but the law moving on its own timetable. There were ripples that did not stop. The procurement manager's initials were on a file that revealed pressure to reallocate costs. The manager had since retired with no prosecution. Some families pursued legal avenues. Some were satisfied with the direct reparative measures Julian had funded. Others sought formal accountability through courts. The story, as it always does, splintered into different forms of closure and continued pain. Through it all, Lila continued to be a child who loved drawing suns. She asked questions in small, ordinary ways. Why did people look sad? Why did grown-ups talk so much about dates? Julian answered with the careful truth he had promised. Sometimes adults make decisions that hurt people because they think they are doing right. We're trying to fix it now. He told her no more than she could hold. Malik watched the tenderness between them and allowed himself to be part of it. He no longer felt the need to keep everything private, as if isolation were a virtue. The neighborhood shifted in ways slow and stubborn. Rosa organized an exhibit of small objects, photographs, a faded sticker, a child's crayon drawing, so the community's memory would be preserved. The archive opened on a Saturday, and people came with stories. They pinned names to maps. They read aloud the list Malik's mother had kept and found other names that needed to be remembered. One afternoon, after the investigators had presented their findings and Julian had begun the work of funding community oversight, Malik sat with his mother's photograph under the floorboard and a small, softer book of relief. He placed the shoebox in Rosa's care to be kept as an archive for families, no longer a burden he alone carried, but a record to be held by the neighborhood. The act felt like a ritual, handing memory to a place where it would be seen and not hidden. Malik and Julian met in the billionaire's study, not as man and investor, but as two people who had walked through a corridor of discovery together and come out altered. The room had large windows that looked over a tree-lined drive. Julian had once seemed all surface and control. Now he sat with his hands unclasped. He had begun to change policies in his company, to insist that budgets for community work could not be created by sacrificing safety. He had started a fund to audit future contractors, and he had arranged for an independent chair for the procurement board. "Words are cheap," Malik said quietly. "Actions are what matter." Julian looked at him without the guard of posture. "I know," he said, "and I will do them. Not for headlines, because I am responsible for the structures I run, for the decisions made under my watch. I can't give you back what you lost, but I can make space so it doesn't happen again." Malik let the sentence settle. He didn't ask for apologies to undo the past. He asked for accountability that would shape future choices. The billionaire's response, humble and human, was all he could have asked for. There was one final discovery that made the investigation into something more than procedural. Rosa had been cataloguing the neighborhood's ephemera and found, folded into an old parcel, a thin ledger from Julian's early charitable projects. It bore a notation in small, blunt handwriting, funds allocated under community maintenance, and beside it, in softer ink and with an unsettling resemblance to Julian's own cramped script from years ago, a note, "Ensure outreach and maintenance balanced." The note was not an instruction to cut corners. It read like a plea. Julian had once written it decades before as an expression of ethic. He had not meant to have that note turn into a justification for ignoring the human costs of budgetary decisions. Seeing his own handwriting there, as part of the archive, was like seeing the outline of a younger man who had wanted to do good, but had maybe not foreseen the ways systems would drift. It made him weep in the study, quietly, which surprised him. Malik sat with him, not saying anything, because sometimes grief and responsibility share the same shape. The aftermath stretched on. The independent investigation recommended establishing a memorial for those lost in the collapse and a fund for neighborhood safety. Julian agreed. He met families, helped build a small garden where names were carved into a stone bench. Malik planted a young maple in the park adjacent to the market. Lila drew the tree with crayons and promised it shade. People talked about forgiveness in the weeks that followed, and Malik thought about it as a thing that looks different depending on the light. Forgiveness is not forgetting. For Malik, it became a deliberate choice to stop letting the past dictate every small thing of the present. He did not absolve those who had made negligent choices. He asked for repair. The company changed procurement oversight and set a precedent of releasing old files when community housekeepers requested them. For some families, that was enough. For others, it was only a first step. A public hearing took place months after the initial report. It unfolded in a town hall that smelled of coffee and old varnish. Julian testified, not to plead, but to explain the structural changes he would initiate. He took responsibility as the head of a company that had allowed practices to occur under its watch. It was not a confession of criminal act. It was, in legal terms, a public assumption of ethical leadership. Julian's words were met with both criticism and gratitude. The room held the complicated hum of accountability, the messy intersection where restitution and anger meet. Malik listened to the hearing on a small radio in Rosa's archive. He heard Julian's voice steady, sometimes breaking, sometimes firm. He heard families read statements into microphones. The law would run its course where it needed to. Malik's individual closure did not require headline justice. It required that the structural causes be addressed. The hearing recommended further legal review. It also recommended funding for local infrastructure assessment. When the days quieted, Julian came to Malik's market and paused at a stall the way he had paused months before. He bought a bag of oranges like the ones Malik used to carry, and then walked the market as an ambiguous subject. No entourage, no camera, but a man who had to be present and accountable. People watched him with mixed curiosity and restraint. He stopped at Malik's old stall and asked simply, "May I help?" Malik handed him an orange with a steady hand. The gesture felt like an offering not of charity, but of shared labor. The two of them stood in the busy light and passed fruit between their hands like a small liturgy of the ordinary. Lila, racing nearby with Zoe and the other children, stopped and handed Malik a new drawing, one of the three of them under a big sun. She had drawn Julian a little smaller than Malik, as children do when gauging where people fit in the world. "Will you sign the petition to keep the memorial in the park?" Malik asked Julian later that day. "And will you fund the watchdog group Asha recommended?" "Yes," Julian said without hesitation, "and I'll allocate seed funding for independent audits for 2 years." Malik could feel the possibility of trust setting into place, cautious and brittle, but real. He did not promise to be a friend to Julian overnight. Reconciliation of hearts is a slow craft. You cannot force the grain to align. But the two of them had begun to make the boards: accountability, public admission, reparative funds, and independent oversight. Those were the things that might keep others from inheriting the same grief. In the neighborhood, things changed in small ways. A sign was hung at the community center listing contractors, with a note that all future contracts would be subject to public review. The youth center hosted safety workshops funded by Julian's new program. Rosa's archive became a place where history could be consulted without fear that it would disappear. Malik began to teach a small class at the center: how to keep records, how to notice signs, how to collect names, so that the next mother who bought a shoebox for photographs might know that her notes would be seen. One late afternoon, Malik sat with a cup of tea and a clean copy of his mother's notebook pages, now catalogued and photocopied. He read the lines that named contractors and dates, and he felt a kind of salve in seeing them on paper that had been acknowledged by more than his hands. Rosa had placed a ribbon around the shoebox and put a small label. Remember, the word was not majestic. It was enough. Julian visited the memorial garden the day the bench was unveiled. He stood by the stone as names were read, listening as if the words had weight. No one made grand speeches. Grief could neither be concluded by a brass plaque nor excused by a check. But the ceremony was honest. People named, people remembered, and the city listened. Lila ran her fingers along the carved names and then looked up at Malik and Julian. "Will the tree grow?" she asked. "It will," Malik said, and for the first time in months the future seemed something he might walk into instead of avert from. When the story settled into neighborhoods and columns and hearings, people asked Malik if he felt vindicated. He answered with a nuance that felt truer. Not vindicated, heard. That's different. My mother wanted her words to mean something. They do now. Julian, now older in a new way, continued to change some of the company practices. He reorganized procurement to include community liaisons and independent audits. He did not become a villain or a saint. He became a man who could, at last, face what his choices had allowed. At the edge of the market, by a stall that sold ribbons, Malik pinned Lila's crayon sun to a community board where memories and notices hung. It fluttered in the breeze like a small flag. Lila held his hand as they walked, and the city around them buzzed with the ordinary negotiations of survival and kindness. Months later, an official letter arrived at Malik's door. An acknowledgement from a municipal office that they would review contractor oversight in light of the independent report. It was not a triumph, it was paper with a next step. But to Malik it read like the outline of a future that might be different from the past. At night, he still slept with the photograph of his parents under his pillow sometimes, as if proximity could keep memory warm. He kept the black notebook safe, now catalogued and accessible in Rosa's archive, for anyone who wished to see the record of a family's vigilance. He had learned that memory shared is memory protected. In the quiet, after the storm, Malik and Julian continued to meet. Their friendship never became simple. It bore the weight of what happened between them: rescue, gratitude, discovery, accusation, and then a long work of repair. They argued sometimes and paused other times and listened more than they had before. The dynamic between the market boy and the billionaire softened into something like companionship, built on mutual responsibility. One afternoon, Lila slipped a small paper heart into Malik's palm, the same kind of contraband sanctity she had given him months back. "Don't forget to come to my drawing show," she said, solemn as a mayor. "I will put your name on the sun." "I won't forget," Malik promised and meant it. When the dust finally settled into the grooves of the city, when the memorial plantings had taken root, and the oversight committee had met twice, Malik found himself standing at the market stall, watching a new boy carry a box of oranges. He thought of how simple decisions had bounded those lives, how a choice to speed something up had ripple effects, and how another kind of choice had been made too, a man choosing to look. He had, in the end, the shoebox under Rosa's care, Lila's drawing pinned to his wall, a job that still smelled of citrus and early mornings, and a new kind of watchfulness. It was not the neat justice the movies promise. It was a slow, human reckoning. On the bench at the memorial garden, Julian sat sometimes and simply watched the neighborhood go about its quiet business. He read children's sketches left in a weatherproof box and learned the grammar of apology without theatrics, consistent action over time. He had been shocked by what he discovered in secret, the bureaucratic trail that tied his company's choices to the tragedy that had shaped Malik's life. The discovery had not been an endpoint, but an opening, a responsibility he had to accept, and a system he could not pretend was beyond his hand. As for Malik, he kept the photograph of his parents in a place where the light would find it. He visited the memorial and the archive, and taught the small record-keeping classes at the center. He spoke sometimes at community gatherings about names and notebooks and the small power of documenting. He never asked Julian to be his father. He never demanded one moment of theatrical repentance. He asked for truth, repair, and change, and he got a measure of each. Sometimes, on slow afternoons, people still stopped to look at the photo of the market rescue, the old photograph that had made headlines. They would point at the man in the suit and at the boy with the oranges and say, with the city's usual mixture of curiosity and speed, "Remember when?" And the truth, which is sometimes quieter than headlines, was this: that what had begun as a rescue in the sunlit market had become a chain of human decisions, small and bureaucratic, that ended in tragedy and then in painstaking repair. In the middle of it all, the little girl, now an adopted daughter, whose life had been steadied by care, kept drawing suns. She continued to be a child, protected and not used, her dignity preserved by people who learned to hold truth without throwing her into the fray. Months after the hearings and the memorial and the planting, Malik found himself seated at Rosa's table with Julian across from him, the archive's radio muting the city's chatter. They shared a silence that was less full of questions now and more oriented toward doing. "Would you have thought," Julian said, surprising Malik with the softness in the question, "that a sticker on a backpack would unthread so much?" Malik smiled. It was a small, guarded thing. "No, but things like that do sometimes," he said. "Names travel." Julian nodded, and for a moment they both watched Lila run toward the park, her braid a red slash of motion. She carried a small sketchbook and a ribbon, and for reasons children know that adults forget, a certainty that the world could be made kind again. Before they left the archive, Malik slipped the photocopy of his mother's circled Arden into Rosa's notebook with a pencil note, "For the record." Rosa tucked it into the folder with the careful gestures of someone who understands that memory needs custody. When the story finally quieted in newspapers, it lived in other places, in the minutes of meetings that reformed procurement, in handheld notebooks at the youth center, in the stone benches carved names, and in the way people in the market began to ask for a contractor's name before a job was done. And in that quiet, a question lingered, a simple one for anyone who had watched the story unfold. When you learn a truth that could hurt the people you love, what do you do? Malik had chosen to reveal and to insist on independent inquiry, rather than protect an image. Julian had chosen to answer and to risk his reputation to do so. The choices had not made everything right. They had, however, changed the shape of what might come next. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more tense human stories that sit at the edge of mercy and truth. And tell us in the comments, if you discovered a secret that tied someone you cared about to a harm, would you reveal it or protect them?